Welcome to the wonderful disaster known as being a teenager in ancient Rome, a time when adulthood slammed into you at age 13 like a runaway chariot fashion, meant wrapping yourself in 10 feet of wool and calling it confidence before you even blink. The city wakes you not with a gentle nudge, but with a full-on sonic assault. The neighbor's mule is screaming like it's auditioning for tragedy. Roosters shriek. Cobblestones echo with bickering over bread prices. And you haven't even opened your eyes, yet already knowing this day will be chaotic, slightly humiliating, and unmistakably Roman. If you're wealthy, you stir beneath soft linens in a villa so opulent it could make Jupiter jealous, mosaic floors gleaming, open-air courtyards breathing, though breathing also means icy drafts sneaking in like spectral pranksters. A servant rouses you with the weary resignation of someone who traded dreams for duty. "Young master," they whisper. But what they mean is, please rise before the rooster starts its aria again. If you're poor, you wake because your younger brother just rolled off his straw pallet directly onto your face. Your mattress, straw unpacked earth, your alarm clock, the symphony of the entire insula shouting at once, vendors, neighbors, goats, gods. You seriously consider inventing the door just for the illusion of peace. Then comes the smell. Rome doesn't greet you with flowers or morning dew. It hits you with a full-bodied bouquet, warm bread, olive oil, human sweat, incense, woods, and that mystery splash your upstairs neighbor just tossed out the window. Privacy. Never met her. Tranquility. Moved to Greece years ago. Your feet meet the florcal terracotta, if you're lucky, cold dirt if you're not. Either way, it stings like regret. You stumble past baskets, broken amphorae, your father's rusted tools, and at least one cat sitting like a minor deity who's personally offended by your existence. And just as you think it can't get louder, does. Vendors hawk fresh figs that saw better days last week. Bakers boast about their loaves like they've just brokered world peace. Street kids sprint past like tiny, barefoot legionaries fueled by stolen grapes. This is your morning. This is Rome. It doesn't whisper, rise and shine. It grabs your tunic and yells, survive. Breakfast. Don't get your hopes up. Calling it a meal is generous. It's more like a polite suggestion that food exists. If you're rich, you get bread dipped in honey, a few wrinkled olives, maybe some goat cheese, basically a snack your uncle pretends is elegant while secretly starving. Slaves serve it with the expression of people who know you'll complain no matter what if you're poor. You get bread, just bread, the kind so hard it doubles as a weapon. You soften it in watered wine, not because you're trying to get tipsy, but because Roman tap water tastes like a swamp with existential dread. Yes, teenagers drink wine for breakfast, not as a party trick's hydration. Meanwhile, modern parents panic over a sugary latte. Your family gathers around a wooden plank masquerading as a table. Your father's already ranting about taxes or that neighbor who looked at him funny. Your mother, she's mentally juggling a dozen tasks, rituals, shopping, cleaning, and the full-time job of making sure you don't disgrace the family name before lunch. If you're wealthy, a slave holds your sandals like it's a sacred duty. If you're not, your mom chucks them at you from across the room with the precision of a Praetorian guard. You step outside, and Rome slaps you awake again. The scent of street food sizzles in the air. A fishmonger swears his catch is fresh. His rival swears it's 3 days dead. A beggar debates a pigeon over breadcrumbs. Breakfast is over. Fuel, barely. But Rome doesn't care. It's already waiting in. Yes, it's still yelling. Here's the thing about being a teen in Rome. There is no teenage phase, no awkward in-between, no grace, period. At 13, Rome looks you in the eye and says, "Congratulations. You're an adult now. Act like one." For boys, it starts with the toga virilissa, heavy, unwieldy slab of white wool that's less symbol of manhood and more hostile bedsheet with a personal vendetta. One day you're barefoot and chasing dogs. The next, you're swaddled like a ceremonial dumpling, trying not to trip in front of half the forum while your family beams like you've just conquered Carthage. Inside, your brain is still asking, are there snacks? Outside, you're expected to debate philosophy like Cicero's long-lost nephew. And if you're a girl, the shift is even sharper. Yesterday, clay dolls and wool scraps. Today, your mother says, let's discuss your marriage. At 13, while you're still figuring out how to braid your own hair. Rome doesn't believe in finding yourself. It assigns you. Son of a baker, you'll bake. Daughter of a merchant, you'll balance ledgers. No options, no gap years. Just duty, draped in expectation. Every move is watched. Your posture, your Latin, the way you glance at someone in public. Rome runs on gossiping. Every citizen is a critic with a front row seat. Hobbies, monitored. Reading, good. Gambling, scandalous. Staring too long at gladiators. Depends who saw you. Maturity isn't earned, it's demanded. The toga. It slips off your shoulder like it's bored of you. It tangles around your legs like a jealous lover. In wind, it tries to strangle you. Touch the ground. Instant shame and dirt that'll never come out. Rome is dusty, chaotic, and splashed with unidentified liquids that defy chemistry, but you wear it anyway, because it screams, I am a man. Even though you're 13, still scared of public speaking, and just learned how to tie your sandals without help. Your day, packed. School isn't in quiet halls, it's outdoors, in the middle of market chaos. Your teacher drones on about Plato, while a fishmonger argues 3 feet away. You copy Greek verses on wax tablets as stray dogs eye them like chew toys. You train in rhetoric because Romans believe the path to power isn't swords or money, it's words. Words delivered with enough flair to move the Senate, or at least shut up your cousin during dinner after school. You follow your father to the forum where politics is theater. Merchants are warriors of price, and senators lie with such conviction you almost believe them. He claps your shoulder. One day, this will be you, you think. One day. I hope I can walk in this toga without looking like I'm wrestling Poseidon. And let's not forget physical training, marching, wooden swords, trying to look fierce while your arms shake. Being a Roman teen boy isn't relaxing. It's a high-stakes performance in fabric that hates you. For girls, life snaps shut like a trap. One moment, childhood. The next, household management and marriage prospects. Your day starts before dawn, but because you want to. But because Roman mothers treat sunlight as optional and productivity as divine law, you weave, spin, scrub, cook, and wring laundry in steaming vats wondering which god you must bribe to invent the washing machine. If you're wealthy, you supervise servants and learn to host dinners where every guest judges your life like it's a play. Your mother teaches you to smile while calculating how to stretch olive oil rations and how to avoid scandal in a city where drama is the national sport. If you're poor, you run market stalls, carry water heavier than you are, bargain with merchants who think they're comedians, and chase siblings before they burn the house down, all while knowing by 14 your parents are already vetting future husbands. Rich, good, respectable family. Better, breath smells like fermented anchovies. Unfortunate, but workable. That's a luxury. A Greek poem. Something only the idle rich can afford. Your mother trains you like a general because one day you'll run a household, and she won't let you fail over something as trivial as running out of lentils. You're 13, and Rome assumes you're already fully grown. School. Forget quiet libraries and motivational posters. Roman school happens in the street. You sit near a fish stall, stylus in hand, trying to parse Homer while a donkey brays behind you. Your classmates, a dozen kids with the attention span of sparrows on espresso. You learn Latin and Greek because why make life easy? You practice speeches meant to stir souls, while resisting the urge to throw your wax tablet at that dog chewing your homework later. If your family can afford it, you study with a grammaticus master of literature, geometry, and the art of crafting an insult so elegant Cicero's ghost might applaud. Discipline, enforced with a stick so infamous it has its own nickname. The pressure is relentless. Be sharp, be poised, be Roman, and for the love of all gods don't trip in your toga during your first public address, because in Rome, education isn't just about knowledge. It's training for a life lived under constant scrutiny, and Rome is always watching. By 13, Rome has one message for you. You are now useful, not cute, not in progress, useful, poor. Your day is a blur of chores, hauling water, feeding animals, scrubbing floors, stomping laundry in tubs, like you're taming wild beasts. Your brother shakes rugs from the balcony like he's summoning a sandstorm, and you just breathe it in. Boy's apprentice with blacksmith's soot, sweat and grunts, or potters carry clay. Don't break anything. The man has the patience of a hangry bull. Girl's apprentice at home, weaving, budgeting, managing stores, learning to run a household like a silent CEO. Even the wealthy aren't idle. They supervise, which means standing around, looking thoughtful while slaves do the work. And if you're truly elite, you endure etiquette lessons. How to sit, how to hand a cup, how to avoid social death by wearing the wrong sandals to a festival, no matter your classroom sees. Teenagers, not as future adults, but as current workers. You're not preparing for life. You're already living it. Yet somehow, you still have a social life. Loud, messy, gloriously chaotic. Your friends are your fellow survivors. The neighbor who once blamed a broken amphora on a dog. The cousin who can haggle better than a senator. The girl who rolls her eyes the second an adult turns away. You meet in the forum, at street stalls, or outside taverns selling garum-soaked snacks. You debate vital questions. Which gladiator has the best abs? Is our rhetoric teacher secretly cursed? Did you see Senator Gravitas trip over his toga yesterday? You play ball in courtyards, gamble with knucklebones, and invent tag games so complicated not even the gods understand the rules. Boys wrestle in the dust. Girls gather to weave and whisper secrets that would make matrons faint. And then the baths, the ultimate teen hangout. Even if you're broke, you save a coin for entry. Inside, you sweat, splash, gossip, and pretend you're sophisticated while really just being gloriously, noisily young in a cloud of steam that you hope hides your secrets. Of course, sneaking out is mandatory. You spy on gladiator warm-ups, watch chariot teams train, or listen to street comedians practice dirty jokes. Every outing feels like a spy, mission complete with dramatic whispers and last-minute sprints when things go sideways. Because in a city that never sleeps, never quiets, and never stops judging, you cling to the people who get it. And then there's fashion, the silent enemy. Roman clothing isn't worn, it's wrestled. Boys, the toga is your nemesis. It's heavy, it's hot, and it will betray you in public. Senators make it look effortless because they have slaves adjusting it every 10 minutes. You're one gust of wind away from becoming a fabric burrito. Girls, your stola and pala are elegant. In theory, in reality, they snag on door frames, trip you on stairs, and catch on passing goats. Your hair, an architectural marvel held together by pins, prayers, and sheer willpower. One breeze and your whole look becomes wind-blown peasant. Jewelry isn't optionally clay or bone if you're not. And sandals, practical in summer, tragic in winter. The strap always snaps at the worst moment, like when you're crossing a puddle that definitely isn't rainwater. Rome judges everything. Too plain, suspicious. Too fancy, also suspicious. Wrinkled tunic, unforgivable. Toga touching the ground. You've dishonored your ancestors. Fashion in Rome demands two things: confidence and the ability to constantly adjust your outfit like you're diffusing a bomb. You're not just dressed, you're draped in symbolism, wrapped in expectation, and tied together with hope and a few well-placed pins. Stepping outside is like entering a live-action gladiator arena. For pedestrians, the streets aren't paved paths, they're living, breathing chaos. Vendors shout like their lives depend on it. Fresh bread, fresh fish, fresh lies. Smells shift every block. Incense, sewage, roasting meat, spilled wine, and that thing your neighbor threw out at dawn. You dodge donkey carts driven by men who believe pedestrians exist to be run over. Sidestep beggars, street performers, and children who move like caffeinated lizards. Shops burst with life. Bakers pull golden loaves from ovens. Blacksmiths hammer metal so hard your bones vibrate. Barbers shave customers in full view of the street. Tavern keepers lure you with wine offers you'll regret by sunset. Performers are everywhere. Lute players, poets, acrobats, whose flips make your mother mutter prayers. Some are talented, most are loud, all are unforgettable. If you hear wheels, you run. Roman drivers obey to laws. Speed is life. Pedestrians are obstacles. Soldiers patrol like stone-faced statues, reminders that Rome watches, always. They don't smile, they don't blink. They just observe, waiting for you to mess up. Yet, for all its noise, stench, and danger, the streets thrill. They pulse with energy. They're messy, magnificent, and utterly alive. And as a Roman teenager, they're your kingdom. But nothing beats a Roman festival. Rome throws parties like it's trying to distract the gods from noticing they're bankrupt. Take Saturnalia, one glorious week in December, when the world flips, masters serve slaves, gambling is legal, teens run wild, wearing bright tunics and eating honey cakes until they question the existence of tooth decay or Lupercalia. Though festival modern parents would ban on sight. Half-naked priests sprint through the streets, whipping bystanders with goat hide for fertility. You pretend you're only watching ironically. But let's be real, it's pure, chaotic joy. Then there's Floralia, flowers, dancing, theater, and people acting dramatic for no reason. Girls love the fashion. Boys love, well, they deny it when asked. Every festival means street stalls, music, magic tricks, probably rigged, and crowds so dense you lose your friends and find new ones in the same breath. You wander with your crew, sticky-fingered from roasted nuts, laughing at street mimes, believing for one night that Rome isn't just a city of duty, but a place where you can be young, loud, and gloriously alive. So yes, being a teenager in ancient Rome is chaos. It's exhaustion, expectation, and fabric that hates you. It's memorizing Greek verbs while a donkey brays in your ear. It's learning to manage a household at 13. It's walking a social tightrope in sandals that keep breaking. But it's also friendship forged in noise, joy stolen in alleyways, and the wild, defiant thrill of being seen not just as a future adult, but as a person right now in the glorious, messy heart of the empire. Welcome to Rome, your togas slipping, the cities yelling, and your story. Welcome to Rome, your togas slipping, the cities yelling, and your story. It's just beginning. In ancient Rome, teenagers didn't just watch theater, they lived it, and not the quiet, thoughtful kind. Rome loved body comedies, performed by actors in masks so grotesquely exaggerated they could haunt your dreams for weeks. Think bulging eyes, mouths wide enough to swallow gossip whole, noses like eagle beaks, judging your life choices. Add to that, acrobats flipping through the air like human fireworks, musicians plucking lyres with divine flair, and crowds dancing with abandon, spinning, leaping, shouting in till the very stones of the city seemed to vibrate with joy. During festivals, Rome didn't just celebrate, it transformed into a playground. But the party didn't stop when the flutes fell silent. For Roman teens, true obsession lay elsewhere. The amphitheater. You and your friends would sneak off, strictly for educational purposes, of course, to watch gladiators train. Muscular, sweat-slicked warriors clashing with wooden swords, their footwork precise, their shouts echoing like war cries. Your mother called the games too violent. Your father called them essential to Roman identity. You insisted you were there for the tactics. Sure you were. Then there was the circus, Maximus Rome's beating heart of speed, danger, and tribal fandom. Chariot racing wasn't just sport, it was Formula One meets MMA with horses. Teams had colors, chants, and cult-like followings. Teens painted symbols on their sandals, wore their team's hue like battle paint, and screamed themselves hoarse as chariots thundered around the track at breakneck speed. Winning felt like destiny, losing like a personal betrayal by the gods. These weren't just diversions, they were freedom, joy, rebellion disguised as entertainment. In a world of rigid expectations, festivals and games were the only places where you could be loud, wild, and gloriously yourselves. And then there were the baths. If you imagine Roman bathhouses as quiet, serene oases of relaxation, congratulations. You've never been to Rome. The truth. The baths were chaotic, steam-drenched, social supernovas, the Roman teens' ultimate hangout. Forget cafes or parks. In a city where streets were treacherous and your house was a chore minefield, the baths were neutral ground, loud, crowded, humid, and free of parental surveillance. Mostly, you didn't say, "Wanna hang out?" You said, "Meet me at the baths." For just a single coin even the poorest families could afford, it too stepped inside and got hit by a wall of heat so intense, it felt like your soul was sweating. Inside, a labyrinth of rooms, each hotter than the last dot. First, the appetite changing room where you stripped down, shoved your clothes into a cubby, and prayed the attendant wasn't having a creative interpretation of honesty. Theft wasn't common, it was tradition. Then the tepidarium, warm and crowded, with 50 other people doing the exact same awkward stretch. Then the caldarium, the hot room, steam so thick you couldn't see your hand. Elderly men ranted about taxes. Politicians schemed in corners, and teens. You huddled in steamy nooks, whispering gossip so explosive it could topple a console. Your hair frizzed, your skin glistened, your toga-induced stress melted away briefly, and then the frigidarium, the cold plunge, Rome's version of a dare. You took a breath, leaped in, and immediately regretted every life choice that led you here. The water was colder than your mother's glare when you used sarcasm at dinner. Your friends howled with laughter as you gasped like a fish on land. Between dips, you munched on olives or honey cakes, complained about school, admired carvings of famous gladiators on the walls, and definitely stole glances at that cute someone from the forum trying and failing to look casual. The baths weren't about hygiene. They were therapy, community, sanctuary, the ancient Roman mall, gym, cafe, gossip hub, and Tinder all rolled into one gloriously sweaty temple of teenage survival. But freedom came at a cost because Roman parents had expectations that hit like a runaway chariot. Rome didn't care. But freedom came at a cost because Roman parents had expectations that hit like a runaway chariot. Rome didn't care that you were 13. It didn't care that your voice cracked or your toga kept strangling you. You were ready. You were capable. You were responsible, whether you felt it or not. For boys, your father summoned you for the talk, not about birds and bees, but about honor, duty, and posture. "Son," he'd say, eyes glistening with ancestral pride, "you must train your mind like a scholar, your body like a soldier, your speech like an orator. Walk with dignity, speak with precision, and for Jupiter's sake, stop slouching. The neighbors can see." He'd gesture toward the horizon like the gods were taking notes. Your mother would nod, already mentally updating your resume for girls. The pressure was doubled. Your mother became your general, your home, your training ground. You learned to weave, budget, manage servants, host dignitaries, oversee religious rites, and stretch olive oil supplies like a wartime strategist. And then marriage, not a distant dream, not a romantic fantasy, a strategic project already underway. Your parents weighed dowries, alliances, and rumors like generals planning a campaign. Does he own land? Is his breath only mildly fishy? Has he ever been accused of treason? Excellent. You sat quietly, smiling politely. while screaming inside. Rome didn't allow teenage rebellion, not because teens didn't want to rebel, but because rebellion ended in a 3-hour lecture about ancestors, Jupiter, droughts, and how your poor posture might offend the household gods. Rome didn't raise teenagers, it forged them under fire, under gaze, under the unbearable weight of expectation. And yet, love still found a way, because even in a city obsessed with duty, teenagers fell hard, fast, and dramatically. You'd spot someone across the forum adjusting their toga without tripping, and suddenly the gods had spoken. Or at the baths, their hair miraculously unruined by steam, and your heart declared, "This is fate." Never mind, you'd never spoken. Details were for lesser mortals. Your friends, useless. Write them a poem. Pretend you're lost. Just go talk to them. Teenagers invented bad romantic advice long before TikTok. Boys tried to impress with grand gestures, standing awkwardly nearby, reciting Ovid badly, or pretending their toga wasn't slowly suffocating them. Their love notes read like emotional grocery lists. Your eyes equals stars. Also, do we have bread? Girls had it harder. A direct approach. Scandalous. Instead, you mastered the sideways glance, subtle, lethal, devastating. You passed in the market, exchanged shy smiles while your mothers haggled over cabbage prices, and wove secret meanings into every blink. Love letters did exist, but not folded notes. They were wax tablets inscribed with lines like, "Your beauty burns brighter than Vesta's eternal flame," which you prayed your parents never found. If they did, expect a lecture longer than a Senate filibuster. And of course, gossip. Rome was the world capital of it. Tell one friend, and by sunset, the baker, the senator, and the stray dogs all had opinions on your relationship. But love persisted, because even in a city of stone and duty, teenagers ached, hoped, and imagined futures far beyond their family walls. In Rome, love wasn't private, it was theater, art, survival, and occasionally complete, beautiful disaster by your late teens. Rome had already decided your future, not asked, decided. No time to find yourself, no gap years, no figuring it out. Rome believed self-discovery was for Greeks with too much wine and too little sense. If you were a boy, adulthood arrived with a handshake and a toga. Your father dragged you into the forum, introducing you to senators, merchants, magistrates, all waiting to judge whether you'd uphold Roman values. You nodded politely, even as your brain screamed, "I still can't fold this toga." Your path, law, politics, military, family, business, and duties you hadn't signed up for. Honor ancestors, avoid scandal, manage finances, and eventually produce heirs. No pressure if you were a girl. You didn't step into adulthood, you ran a household like a general, managing staff, budgets, rituals, guests, and crises. And then came marriage, not romance, but alliance. Your job. Be graceful, competent, and never ever embarrass the family. Everyone watched. Everyone judged. Everyone expected greatness, or at least competence, which in Rome was basically the same thing. And yet, you adapted, you complained quietly, panicked internally, begged Jupiter for a break. But Rome shaped you. Its noise strengthened you. Its chaos prepared you. You weren't just a teen anymore. You were Roman, ready or not. You marched forward with the empire. Centuries later, in the misty courts of medieval Europe, something even stranger emerged: courtly love, a system so bizarre, so gloriously illogical. It turned impossible desire into a virtue. Forget, don't commit adultery. Medieval aristocrats invented a loophole: adore someone passionately, but never touch them. Romance became a philosophical sport complete with rules, rituals, and an alarming number of poems written by men who hadn't bathed since Easter. At its heart, impossibility. The ideal lady was always married to someone older, richer, and suspicious of poetry, especially French poetry. But that wasn't a problem. It was the point. Medieval poets insisted real love must be unfulfilled if you could have it. It wasn't noble if you couldn't. Perfection. This wasn't about passion, it was about performance. The knight didn't woo to win, he worshipped. He carried her token into battle: a ribbon, a glove, or, let's be honest, a scrap of fabric he definitely stole. He sang her praises in tournaments, often in front of her husband, who was usually funding the whole event, and the lady. Her role was delicate: inspire virtue, correct his behavior with polite cruelty, and reject him with such grace he loved her more. She wasn't a person, she was a symbol, a muse, a moral GPS. In a world where noble women had little power, courtly love gave them a strange kind of influence: the power to make men compete, suffer, improve, or write terrible poetry. This wasn't romance, it was weaponized longing, socially approved heartbreak, dressed in velvet and verse. But who were these ladies really? In poetry, she was divine. Her smile tamed lions, her voice healed wounds, her beauty softened God's wrath. In reality, she was managing grain stores, negotiating dowries, surviving plagues, and praying bandits didn't steal the harvest. Poets weren't writing about real women, they were writing about the lady, a fictional goddess who lived in their dreams and saddlebags. Yet this pedestal gave noble women unexpected sway. In a society that denied them direct power, being idealized even falsely tilted the world in their favor. Meanwhile, the knight, he was on his knees, swearing eternal loyalty to a woman who could end his entire fantasy with a raised eyebrow. His devotion wasn't casual. It was a full-time emotional occupation. He picked a lady specifically because she was unavailable. If love was easy, it wasn't noble. He vowed obedience, moral improvement, and glorious death in her name, though preferably not actual death that would ruin the poetry. He carried her colors, lost jousts, and wrote verses blaming himself for not being worthy. A single sigh from her could fuel an epic, a glance, a whole album, if she spoke to him. That was basically winning the medieval Grammy. This wasn't love, it was emotional theater, with suffering as proof of depth, restraint as proof of virtue, and distance as the engine of the whole madness. And it came with rules, dramatic and utterly bonkers. The most famous guide came from Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century cleric who basically wrote the Kama Sutra of unrequited torture. His commandments: love cannot exist between husband and wife. Marriage was too boring for true passion. Secrecy is essential, but also make sure everyone suspects it. Love thrives on difficulty, obstacles. Good, angry husbands. Better, locked towers. Perfect, the lady must show mercy without encouragement, firmness without cruelty. Good luck with that. This was romance, choreographed, like a ballet, where even adultery had an approved aesthetic, and who spread this madness across Europe. The troubadours, poet-musicians of southern France, who turned noble longing into chart-topping hits. Imagine a world where every pop song is about a knight's hopeless crush on a married noblewoman. That was 12th century Provence. They weren't just entertainers. They were gossip engines, reputation sculptors, and emotional arsonists. A well-placed song could elevate a lady to mythical status, or spark a feud that ended in war. Their metaphors, over the top, her hands whiter than milk, her eyes bright as swords, her heart a fortress. Real women probably just wanted to finish their laundry in peace, but the troubadours made longing spectacle. And thanks to patrons like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, then England, an undisputed Beyoncé of courtly love, the whole aristocracy got addicted to structured emotional torment. Why did this flourish? Because medieval marriage was utterly unromantic. It was about land, heirs, and avoiding invasion. Children were betrothed at 3, married at 12. Feelings irrelevant. Your husband might be twice your age, permanently grumpy, and built like a siege weapon. That was just life. Into this emotional dessert came courtly love, a pressure valve for the soul. It let nobles feel, as long as it wasn't for their spouse. It gave women admiration without scandal. It gave men dream beyond DOWRIES. Society condemned adultery, but glamorized wanting what you couldn't have. And so, for centuries, Europe danced this strange, poetic, heartbreaking waltz where the greatest love was the one that never happened, but made the world sing anyway. Precisely because medieval marriage almost never involved romance at all. When your spouse was assigned like a tax bracket, negotiated over land, deeds before you could ride a horse, longing had to go somewhere. And in the courts of Europe, it found its destination. Someone who wrote better poetry. Courtly love was built on a paradox so fragile, it trembled like a spiderweb in a storm. You were supposed to ache for someone you could never touch, but the line between poetic yearning and actual adultery, it wasn't just blurry, it was practically dripping with innuendo. For centuries, clergy raged, nobles schemed, and husbands seethed all while pretending this was just a refined game of emotional chess. The official rule was clear. Courtly love must remain pure, chaste, and gloriously impossible. The unofficial reality, let's just say, many treated those rules like poetic suggestions, inspiring and entirely optional, because this whole system ran on one medieval skill. Above all, pretending. A knight could swear eternal devotion to another man's wife as long as he did it in hexameter, not in a shadowed courtyard. A lady could accept his adoration as long as her smile said, "I honor your loyalty," not "meet me behind the dovecote." In theory, it was emotional theater without consequences. In practice, humans are humans even in the 12th century, and a knight writing 14 sonnets about the curve of a woman's hair wasn't always content to admire from afar. The troubadours made it worse. Their songs dripped with double meanings, hinted at midnight encounters, and sometimes crossed straight into "we all know what's really happening" territory. Courts buzzed with whispers. Which ladies' night got too bold? Which husband is pretending not to notice? Which poet needs to disappear before this scandal burns down a dynasty. And let's be honest, the fact that so many romances ended with the noble declaration, "Our love shall never be consummated," tells you exactly how often the opposite occurred. The church saw it coming in, hated every second of it, clerics thundered from pulpits that even loving in your heart was spiritual adultery, committed entirely in the mind, yet just as damning. They called troubadours agents of moral decay, their melodies catchy poison corrupting noble souls. Meanwhile, the very nobles attending these sermons, they wore their ladies' ribbon pinned proudly to their sleeve. Husbands had it worst. Publicly, they had to play along. Courtly love was fashionable, after all. Privately, many were furious. Medieval law codes are laced with grim hints, sudden accidents, jealous outbursts, knights who fell from high windows. Yet most husbands swallowed their pride. Why? Because a wife admired by a famous knight raised the family's prestige. So they prayed their rival stayed safely in the poetic, suffering phase and never crossed into the scandal phase. Courtly love balanced on a knife's edge. It had to look like adultery without being adultery. It had to burn with desire without ever catching fire, and somehow astonishingly held most of the time. But when it didn't, chaos erupted. This wasn't just flirtation. It was geopolitics with better metaphors. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, patron and undisputed architect of romantic revolution. Her court at Poitiers became a laboratory of longing. Troubadours composing new definitions of love. Noble women debating the ethics of desire. Knights practicing chivalry with such intensity it made husbands sweat. Some historians argue this very culture of emotional theater helped shatter her marriage to Louis VII of France. When a queen wields romantic devotion as political leverage, kingdoms tremble. Or consider Marie de Champagne, who turned love into jurisprudence. She presided over courts of love, semi-serious salons, where nobles debated questions like, can a lady love two men at once? These weren't just intellectual games. They reshaped ideas about loyalty, power, and what a woman owed her husband. And when those ideas reached royal ears, consequences followed. More than one knight died, defending a lady's honor or, at least, defending the rumor that he was defending her honor. A single ill-timed poem could ignite feuds, siege castles, or collapse alliances that had held for generations. The church watched, appalled. Some clerics declared courtly love worse than heresy system. Humans worshipped other humans with devotion meant only for God. One bishop warned it corrupts kingdoms faster than war. And yet, despite excommunications, scandals, and funerals drowned in elegies, courtly love endured. Why? Because in a world of rigid duty and arranged marriages, forbidden affection was the one spark that felt alive, sometimes beautifully, sometimes catastrophic ally. By the time the Middle Ages staggered into twilight worn down by plague, war, and truly unfortunate, courtly love had already rewritten Europe's soul. What began as a poetic pastime among southern French aristocrats became a continental obsession that reshaped literature, romance, and the very definition of desire. And though it was contradictory, impractical, and occasionally lethal, it left a legacy that still echoes in our hearts today. Courtly love invented romantic idealization before it. European stories were about saints, swords, and divine wrath. After, poetry became interior, about the agony of a glance, the ruin of a week by a stranger's smile, the psychological earthquake of longing. It gave us Lancelot and Guinevere, not just lovers, but a moral apocalypse that toppled Camelot. It created the medieval blockbuster formula: noble hero, unattainable lady, dangerous yearning, tragic fallout. Even modern romance owes it a debt. The trope of unrequited love, the pedestal, the idea that true love must suffer. All born in courts where troubadours strummed lyres and noble women pretended to be flattered while mentally calculating grain stores. Every time a novel sighs, "Love is destiny," or a film swells as lovers nearly touch but don't sure, hearing the ghost of a 12th century poet in Occitan, rhyming heart with martyr. But courtly love was never just art. It revealed a deep hunger in medieval society, the need to feel intensely in a world that demanded obedience. Above all, it was rebellion, dressed as devotion, a sanctioned escape hatch for souls trapped in gilded cages. In the end, this bizarre, beautiful madness endured because it made life more dramatic, more poetic, more human. And even now, centuries later, the whisper remains: the greatest love is the one you long for, not the one you possess. But if medieval Europe feared desire, Victorian England pathologized it. The 19th century had an extraordinary talent. It could turn any woman's existence into a medical emergency. Not eating, illness, eating too much, illness, feeling tired, illness, feeling energetic, definitely illness. And if a woman dared to express an opinion or worse, boredom, anger, or desire, doctors would reach for their notebooks like she was some newly discovered species. Homo sapiens, femina, dangerously emotional, SPECIES. Yes. The era gave us germ theory and anesthesia, but it also gave us a catalog of invented female disorders so absurd they'd be funny if they hadn't been used to control, silence, and imprison thousands. At the top of the list, hysteria. According to Victorian physicians, hysteria could be triggered by, well, everything: too much thinking, too little thinking, reading novels, riding horses, wanting children, not wanting children, existing in a room with slightly stale air. Hysteria wasn't a diagnosis. It was a Swiss Army knife of dismissal, and it was almost exclusively reserved for women. Men, oh, they were just overtired. But hysteria was never really about medicine. It was about morality, wearing a stethoscope. If a woman was depressed because she had no legal rights, hysterical. If she was furious because her husband treated her like decorative furniture, hysterical. If she dared to feel sexual desire, not human - pathological. So doctors reached for their arsenal: sedation, isolation, cold baths, electrotherapy, rest cures so extreme they amounted to psychological imprisonment, because admitting her pain had social causes, like being trapped in a loveless marriage or barred from education, would mean admitting society was the problem. Easier to say, her uterus is wandering. Yes, they revived the 2,000-year-old Greek myth that a woman's womb roamed her body like a lost puppy, causing chaos wherever it went, in a culture obsessed with purity and obedience. Diagnosing women became a tool of social control. Desire itself was reframed as malfunction, a fever to be cooled, a flame to be smothered. Victorian medicine didn't just treat illness, it invented it. A silent woman was easier to manage than a suffering one. These weren't treatments, they were acts of erasure framed as compassion, executed as control. Because the real prescription was never health, it was silence. And at the heart of it all, female desire. To Victorian medicine, a woman's sexuality wasn't human, it was a threat, a contagion, gateway to societal collapse. So they it. A woman who wanted intimacy wasn't passionate, she was overstimulated. One dissatisfied in marriage wasn't neglected, she was disordered. They invented nymphomania, a diagnosis that covered everything from normal libido to enjoying marital relations too much, and the treatments: isolation, ice baths, sedation, and in the most horrifying cases, performed to extinguish desire permanently, surgical violence. Justified as science, yet, in a grotesque irony, those same doctors also practiced pelvic massage, inducing orgasm in hysterical women while insisting it was purely clinical, because men couldn't possibly understand what they were doing. This wasn't medicine. Yet, in a grotesque irony, those same doctors also practiced pelvic massage, inducing orgasm in hysterical women while insisting it was purely clinical, because men couldn't possibly understand what they were doing. This wasn't medicine. It was cultural fear that if women claimed autonomy over their bodies, they might demand it over everything. So, pleasure became pathology, desire became disease, and the female body became a battlefield not of cells, but of control. For all its obsession with the imaginary, Victorian medicine revealed a brutal truth. It wasn't trying to heal women, it was trying to erase them, to make them smaller, quieter, more obedient, and in doing so, it exposed the lie at its core. This was never about health, it was about power, and the women who resisted, they didn't just survive. They wrote, they spoke, they remembered, and their voice, drowned in laudanum and silence, now echo louder than ever. Victorian medicine didn't just invent illnesses, failed catastrophically. When women's suffering was real, genuine conditions, endometriosis, postpartum depression, anemia, chronic pain, infections, autoimmune disorders, were routinely dismissed as nerves, moral weakness, or mere female hysteria. The irony was brutal. The same society that diagnosed women for feeling too much refused to believe them when they were truly ill. A woman, writhing in menstrual agony, was told she was exaggerating. One drained by chronic fatigue was labeled lazy. A mother, shattered by childbirth trauma, was not treated. She was declared hysterical. Victorian doctors wrote with supreme confidence about the female body, yet their knowledge was shockingly hollow. Women's anatomy was rarely studied. Their symptoms were rarely trusted. Pain was interpreted not as a signal of disease, but as proof of moral failure, the result of anxiety, impropriety, or insufficient obedience. Nowhere was this more tragic than in the case of postpartum depression. Physicians didn't recognize it as a medical condition. They called it madness. Women grieving, exhausted, or hormonally unmoored after childbirth were isolated, sedated, or plunged into icy baths. Their emotional collapse wasn't seen as a human response to trauma, it was evidence they had failed at femininity. Diseases like endometriosis or PCOS had no names yet. They existed in silence, relentless, invisible, agonizing. When women described their symptoms, doctors rolled their eyes. Theatrical, they wrote in medical journals. Female pain was deemed unreliable even when it pointed to life-threatening illness. Take tuberculosis, the great killer of the age. In women, it was romanticized. Pale skin, thin frames, fever-flushed cheeks, these became the marks of consumptive beauty. Real suffering was turned into fashion. Women were praised for looking frail, then blamed when they died. And the science itself was rigged. Medical research was conducted almost exclusively on men. Treatments were designed for male bodies. Women were treated not as whole human beings, but as fragile, morally unpredictable, variants too delicate for truth, too emotional for objectivity. The result? Women's illnesses vanished from the medical record. If a condition didn't fit the male model, it was pathologized, ignored, or erased. Victorian medicine was dangerous, not just because it invented phantom diseases, but because it refused to see the real ones. And in the silence of that disbelief, countless women suffered without names, without care, without witness. By the century's end, Victorian medicine had draped itself in the robes of science, while quietly preserving ancient fears about women's bodies. And though modern medicine eventually rose, its shadow lingers. The ghosts of hysteria, degeneracy, and moral panic didn't vanish. They changed vocabulary. The idea that women are too emotional, less rational, or prone to overreaction didn't spring from thin air. It was codified in 19th century medical texts, taught in universities, and baked into Western medicine for generations. Today, women's pain is still dismissed more often than men's. Endometriosis takes an average of 7 to 10 years to diagnose. Autoimmune diseases disproportionately affecting women are routinely misread. Anxiety. A woman reporting agony is still told it's probably stress. The echoes are unmistakable. So too with sexuality. The Victorian era medicalized shame, wrapping moral panic in clinical language. Even now, discussions of female pleasure carry whispers of that old guilt, framed not as health, but as transgression. Mental health bears the scars as well. Postpartum depression wasn't formally recognized until the late 20th century, full century after Victorian doctors locked women away for it. Anxiety, trauma, neurodivergence in women were long dismissed because history had already decided female emotion is unreliable, and the legacy of the rest cure lives in the quiet assumption that when a woman is overwhelmed, she should withdraw, rest, be quiet, supported, or believed. But there is another legacy, one forged by women who refused to disappear. Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote The Yellow Wallpaper and exposed the horror of enforced silence. Elizabeth Packard fought her way out of an asylum and launched a campaign for patient rights. Unnamed women kept diaries, spoke in whispers, demanded care. Their resistance planted the seeds for modern psychology, for informed consent, for the slow dismantling of hysteria as a diagnosis. Victorian medicine tried to erase women instead. The women it oppressed helped rewrite medicine itself. The true legacy isn't just the harm done, it's the voices that rose to challenge it. And while Europe grappled with silence and control, another story was unfolding, one of fire, myth, and destiny. Alexander did not enter the world quietly. He was born into a palace, already trembling with ambition. His father, Philip II of Macedon, was a king who reshaped nations like a blacksmith hammering iron. From fractured tribes, he forged a military titan. His court crackled with power, generals like walking statues of leather and steel, diplomats bowing not out of courtesy but fear, servants whispering omens as if the walls themselves breathed prophecy. Olympias was fiercer, still mystical, intense. Utterly convinced of her son's divine bloodline, she told young Alexander he descended from Achilles, and said it with the certainty of a woman who expected the gods to agree. From his first breath, Alexander lived in a world where power was the native language, while other children played with toys. He studied the faces of battle-scarred veterans. His teachers quickly realized this boy was different. He didn't just listen, he interrogated. What was the political lesson in that myth? What terrain decided that battle? Where did the general fail? He devoured the Iliad like scripture. Achilles wasn't a hero, he was a rival, a standard, a ghost who slept under Alexander's pillow. By 10, he'd already revealed the iron in his soul. When Philip's courtiers failed to tame Bucephalus Massive, wild black stallion that reared and kicked at every rider, Alexander saw what others missed. The horse wasn't angry, it was afraid of its own shadow. The boy turned the stallion toward the sun, mounted him calmly, and rode across the field as if they'd known each other for lifetimes. Philip watched in stunned silence. Then he spoke words that would echo through history. My son, seek out a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is too small. It wasn't praise, it was prophecy. At 13, Alexander's education shifted from impressive to legendary. Philip, ever calculating, knew his heir needed more than swords and strategy. He needed a mind forged by genius. So he summoned Aristotle, philosopher, scientist, heir to Plato's legacy, from the hills of Stagira. Alexander expected a warrior teacher. Instead, a man in a linen cloak arrived with scrolls under his arm and questions that cut deeper than any blade. On their first day, Aristotle asked, "Is it better to conquer the world or understand it?" Alexander had never considered there was a difference. At Mysa, in a grove shaded by plane trees, Aristotle built a school not for princes but for future kings. Here, Alexander and a chosen circle Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus studied ethics, astronomy, biology, and politics. They dissected fish, mapped stars, debated justice, and learned that true rule demands thought, not just force. Aristotle taught Alexander to analyze Achilles, not just worship him. Courage, he warned, is not recklessness. But Alexander listened, with half an ear already dreaming of empires. The classroom wasn't just theory. Between lessons, the boys wrestled, raced, recited Homer, and argued Aristotle into corners. Alexander rarely lost, and when he did, he remembered. Here, loyalty was forged, rivalry sharpened, friendships became the bedrock of an empire. For while others dreamed of estates or local glory, Alexander saw only one horizon, the world. Every lesson, math, poetry, Biology was filtered through a single lens. How can this help me unite it all? Misa wasn't a school, it was the seedbed of legend. But Aristotle shaped his mind, Macedonia forged his body. This was no land for soft princes. Its hills echoed with war songs, hoofbeats, and the clang of iron. Boys became warriors young. Alexander was expected to become the finest soldier his kingdom had ever known. Training began before dawn. He rode through icy rivers, marched until his feet bled, mastered the Sarisseth 18-foot pike that defined Macedonian might. Philip pushed him relentlessly. Steep climbs, surprise drills, days without rest. He wanted Alexander to know, fear and conquer it, and Alexander did not with grim endurance, but with fierce joy. Bruises were badges. Exhaustion was fuel. While others collapsed, he kept walking. But this wasn't just discipline, it was imagination in motion. As he rode, he saw. But Aristotle shaped his mind, Macedonia forged his body. This was no land for soft princes. Its hills echoed with war songs, hoofbeats, and the clang of iron. Boys became warriors young. Alexander was expected to become the finest soldier his kingdom had ever known. Training began before dawn. He rode through icy rivers, marched until his feet bled, mastered the Sarisseth 18-foot pike that defined Macedonian might. Philip pushed him relentlessly. Steep climbs, surprise drills, days without rest. He wanted Alexander to know, fear and conquer it. And Alexander did not with grim endurance, but with fierce joy. Bruises were badges. Exhaustion was fuel. While others collapsed, he kept walking. But this wasn't just discipline, it was imagination in motion. As he rode, he saw Persian cavalry on the plains of Asia. As he sparred, he faced the immortals of Xerxes. As he marched, he whispered lines from the Iliad, not as poetry, but as battle hymns. Myth and muscle fused, hero and air became one. And all the while, Olympias whispered, "You are divine." She burned incense, consulted oracles, filled his world with symbols of Achilles and Heracles, not as stories but as birthrights. Philip offered a counter-truth. Greatness is earned in sweat. Aristotle added a third. Greatness must be wise, or it becomes ruin. Alexander absorbed all three. He would be destined but would earn every inch. Yet the truest battlefield wasn't on foreign soil. It was the court of Pella. Philip's palace was a storm of half-siblings, rival wives, and nobles with daggers hidden in their smiles. Every alliance shifted. Every glance carried weight. Olympias warned, "Trust no one who smiles to Italy." And Alexander learned to read people like Aristotle taught him to read nature with precision, suspicion, and silence. He watched who avoided his gaze, who flattered too much, who praised his father but never him. By 16, he could dissect a room with a single glance. Foreign envoys came to assess him. Is this boy king material or just a dreamer in armor? Alexander stood tall, spoke clearly, and let his poise answer for him. Behind closed doors, tension simmered between father and son, admiration laced with rivalry, pride edged with fear. Philip had built an empire from nothing. Alexander seemed born to transcend it. Court sensed it. Some hoped to use him, others hoped he'd fail. But Alexander was already beyond their reach. Then came his first real test. While Philip negotiated abroad, northern tribes rebelled. The king made a shocking choice. He left Alexander in command. The court scoffed. A boy against hardened warriors. But Alexander didn't hesitate. Still wearing armor too large for his frame, he led the cavalry north not as a prince, but as a commander. He studied the land, questioned scouts, planned ambushes with chilling clarity. When the enemy struck, he struck first, flanking them with a cavalry charge so swift, veterans said the gods guided his hand. They were wrong. It was years of obsession, sharpened by Aristotle's logic and Philip's drills, and fueled by a hunger no one could name. He fought at the front, shared every hardship, and his troops loved him for it. When Philip returned, the rebellion was crushed. More astonishingly, his son had become a leader. The king said nothing publicly, but it said he, later, murmured, "My son seeks victory, like a man who believes it belongs to him." From that day, Macedonia saw Alexander not as a boy, but as a storm gathering on the horizon. He was no longer Philip's heir. He was his own force of nature. His mind raced eastward to Persia, the empire that had haunted Greece for a century, while others feared it. Alexander studied it like a hunter studies a lion. He knew his time was coming. Philip was preparing the invasion of Persia. Alexander would stand beside him, perhaps even lead the vanguard. The world was opening, and Alexander felt destiny settling onto his shoulders like armor he was born to wear. He was no longer a student in a grove, no longer a boy reciting Homer by lamplight. He was commander. Heir. Legend in the making. Everything that would make him great was already inside him, waiting only for history to say, now. And so, as the sun rose over Pella, gilding the spears of an army that no longer saw a boy but a king in waiting, Alexander stood not at the edge of his future, but at the threshold of myth made flesh. Every lesson, every bruise, every whispered prophecy from his mother, every stern correction from his father, every razor-sharp question from Aristotle had converged in this single, breathless moment. He was no longer merely the son of Philip or the devotee of Achilles. He was something new, a fusion of philosophy and fury, of divine certainty and human hunger, of Macedonian grit and universal vision. The world he had studied in scrolls, imagined in dreams, and tested in northern skirmishes was no longer a map, it was a promise. And he would claim it, not just with sword and sarissa, but with an idea so radical it would echo for millennia, that the world could be one, not a patchwork of feuding cities and fearful tribes, but a single tapestry woven from Persian silk, Egyptian gold, Greek reason, and Macedonian courage. He would not merely conquer, he would transform. He would not erase cultures, but fuse them. He would speak to barbarians, not with contempt, but with curiosity. He would marry foreign princesses, not just for alliance, but as acts of unity. His ambition was no longer personal glory, it was cosmic architecture. And though he did not yet know the cost that friendship would fracture, that loyalty would bleed, that his own fire would one day consume him, he knew, with the clarity only destiny grants, that stillness was death, that smallness was surrender, and that the gods did not gift a soul like his to waste it on peace. So he tightened the strap of his helmet, felt the weight of the world settle not as a burden, but as a birthright. and turned his horse east, not toward war, but toward what only he could build from its ashes. The age of gods was ending. The age of men had begun. And Alexander, son of myth, student of truth, heir of ironwood, stride into it, not as a conqueror, but as the first true citizen of a world that did not yet exist, but soon would, because he willed it, because he dreamed it, because, in the end, he became it. Motherhood in the ancient world was never just a role. It was a silent revolution, dressed in wool and silence. You didn't choose it. It chose you. At 13, perhaps 14, your mother placed a clay doll in your hands, not as a toy, but as a rehearsal. "This is your future," she said, her voice low, her eyes already calculating how many years you had before your own body would be borrowed by life itself. And when the time came, when your wedding veil was folded away, and your husband's name became your legal address, you didn't become a wife first. You became a vessel, a hope, a risk. Pregnancy wasn't celebrated with honey cakes and gentle songs. It was endured in stillness, in fear, in rooms thick with incense, meant to mask the scent of sweat and dread. Every kick was a prayer, every cramp a warning. You walked carefully, spoke softly, avoided stares, strong smells, loud noises, not for your comfort, but because your body no longer belonged to you. It belonged to the household, the lineage, the future senator, or merchant, or weaver growing inside you. And if you lost the child, you didn't weep openly. You nodded, whispered thanks to the midwife, and returned to weaving your grief folded into every thread, like a secret only your fingers knew. Childbirth was not a moment, it was a trial by fire. No doctors, no clean rooms, just women, your mother, your aunt, the neighbor who'd buried 3 infants but still knew how to tie the cord just right. You screamed into a cloth so the slaves wouldn't hear. You bit your lip until it bled so your husband wouldn't think you weak. And when the baby finally came, slippery, red, furious, you held your breath until it cried, because that cry was your redemption. Proof you had done your duty. Proof you were worthy. But motherhood didn't end with birth. It began there. You nursed through cracked skin and sleepless nights, not out of choice, but because wet nurses were for the very rich hand, even then, only if your own milk lacked virtue. You memorized the curve of your child's brow, the rhythm of their breath, the exact pitch of their hunger cry. You taught them to speak, to bow, to say thank you to elders, to never spill wine at dinner. You corrected their posture with a touch so light no one noticed, but they did. And all the while, you watched. You watched your daughter's eyes dim as she was betrothed at 12. You watched your son march off to training, his voice still cracking, his toga too big. You smiled when guests praised your children's manners while inside you ached with the knowledge that every lesson you gave them was a chain you were helping to forge, because that was the quiet tragedy of motherhood in a world like yours. You loved your children fiercely, and that very love bound them to the same cage that held you. You taught your daughter to be graceful so she wouldn't be gossiped about. You taught your son to be brave so he wouldn't shame the family name. You smoothed their path into society, knowing it led right back to the life you'd never chosen. Yet, still, you loved. Not with grand gestures, but with mended tunics, warmed blankets, hidden glances across the dinner table. with the way you lingered at their door long after they'd fallen asleep, with the prayers you whispered to Vesta, Juno, Diana, begging, not for glory, not for wealth, but for their safety, because in a world that valued women only for whom they married and what they bore, motherhood was your one true power and your deepest silence. You shaped empires, not with swords, but with lullabies, not with speeches, but with the steady, uncelebrated act of keeping a family and a legacy alive, one quiet day at a time. And no historian would ever write your name, but without you, there would be no story to tell. Victorian medicine didn't just invent illnesses. It failed catastrophically when women's suffering was real, genuine conditions: endometriosis, postpartum depression, anemia, chronic pain, infections. Autoimmune disorders were routinely dismissed as nerves, moral weakness, or mere female hysteria. The irony was brutal. The same society that diagnosed women for feeling too much refused to believe them when they were truly ill. A woman, writhing in menstrual agony, was told she was exaggerating. One drained by chronic fatigue was labeled lazy. A mother, shattered by childbirth trauma, was not treated. She was declared hysterical. Victorian doctors wrote with supreme confidence about the female body, yet their knowledge was shockingly hollow. Women's anatomy was rarely studied. Their symptoms were rarely trusted. Pain was interpreted not as a signal of disease, but as proof of moral failure, the result of anxiety, impropriety, or insufficient obedience. Nowhere was this more tragic than in the case of postpartum depression. Physicians didn't recognize it as a medical condition. They called it madness. Women grieving, exhausted, or hormonally unmoored after childbirth were isolated, sedated, or plunged into icy baths. Their emotional collapse wasn't seen as a human response to trauma, was evidence they had failed at femininity. Diseases like endometriosis or PCOS had no names yet. They existed in silence, relentless, invisible, agonizing. When women described their symptoms, doctors rolled their eyes. Theatrical, they wrote in medical journals. Female pain was deemed unreliable even when it pointed to life-threatening illness. Take tuberculosis, the great killer of the age. In women, it was romanticized. Pale skin, thin frames, fever-flushed cheeks, these became the marks of consumptive beauty. Real suffering was turned into fashion. Women were praised for looking frail, then blamed when they died, and the science itself was rigged. Medical research was conducted almost exclusively on men. Treatments were designed for male bodies. Women were treated not as whole human beings, but as fragile, morally unpredictable variants, too delicate for truth, too emotional for objectivity. The result: women's illnesses vanished from the medical record. If a condition didn't fit the male model, it was pathologized, ignored, or erased. Victorian medicine was dangerous not just because it invented phantom diseases, but because it refused to see the real ones. And in the silence of that disbelief, countless women suffered without names, without care, without witness. By the century's end, Victorian medicine had draped itself in the robes of science, while quietly preserving ancient fears about women's bodies. And though modern medicine eventually rose, its shadow lingers. The ghosts of hysteria, degeneracy, and moral panic didn't vanish. They changed vocabulary. The idea that women are too emotional, less rational, or prone to overreaction, didn't spring from thin air. It was codified in 19th century medical texts, taught in universities, and baked into Western medicine for generations. Today, women's pain is still dismissed more often than men's. Endometriosis takes an average of 7 to 10 years to diagnose. Autoimmune diseases disproportionately affecting women are routinely misread. Anxiety. A woman reporting agony is still told it's probably stress. The echoes are unmistakable. So too with sexuality. The Victorian era medicalized shame, wrapping moral panic in clinical language. Even now, discussions of female pleasure carry whispers of that old guilt, framed not as health, but as transgression. Mental health bears the scars as well. Postpartum depression wasn't formally recognized until the late 20th century, full century after Victorian doctors locked women away for it. Neurodivergence in women were long dismissed because history had already decided female emotion is unreliable, and the legacy of the rest cure lives on in the quiet assumption that when a woman is overwhelmed, she should withdraw, rest, be quiet, supported, or believed. But there is another legacy. One forged by women who refused to disappear. Perkins Gilman wrote The Yellow Wallpaper and exposed the horror of enforced silence. Elizabeth Packard fought her way out of an asylum and launched a campaign for patient rights. Countless unnamed women kept diaries, spoke in whispers, demanded care. Their resistance planted the seeds for modern psychology, for informed consent, for the slow dismantling of hysteria as a diagnosis. Victorian medicine tried to erase women. Instead, the women it oppressed helped rewrite medicine itself. The true legacy isn't just the harm done, it's the voices that rose to challenge it. And while Europe grappled with silence and control, another story was unfolding, one of fire, myth, and destiny. Alexander did not enter the world quietly. He was born into a palace, already trembling with ambition. His father, Philip II of Macedon, was a king who reshaped nations like a blacksmith hammering iron from fractured tribes. He forged a military titan. His court crackled with power, generals like walking statues of leather and steel, diplomats bowing not out of courtesy but fear, servants whispering omens as if the walls themselves breathed prophecy. His mother, Olympias, was fiercer, still mystical, intense, utterly convinced of her son's divine bloodline. She told young Alexander he descended from Achilles, and said it with the certainty of a woman who expected the gods to agree. From his first breath, Alexander lived in a world where power was the native language, while other children played with toys. He studied the faces of battle-scarred veterans. His teachers quickly realized this boy was different. He didn't just listen, he interrogated. What was the political lesson in that myth? What terrain decided that battle? Where did the general fail? He devoured the Iliad like scripture. Achilles wasn't a hero, he was a rival, a standard, a ghost who slept under Alexander's pillow. By 10, he'd already revealed the iron in his soul when Philip's courtiers failed to tame Bucephalus, a massive, wild black stallion that reared and kicked at every rider. Alexander saw what others missed. The horse wasn't angry, it was afraid of its own shadow. The boy turned the stallion toward the sun, mounted him calmly, and rode across the field as if they'd known each other for lifetimes. Philip watched in stunned silence. Then he spoke words that would echo through history. "My son, seek out a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is too small." It wasn't praise, it was prophecy. At 13, Alexander's education shifted from impressive to legendary. Philip, ever calculating, knew his heir needed more than swords and strategy. He needed a mind forged by genius. So he summoned Aristotle, philosopher, scientist, heir to Plato's legacy, from the hills of Stagira. Alexander expected a warrior teacher. Instead, a man in a linen cloak arrived with scrolls under his arm and questions that cut deeper than any blade on their first day. Aristotle asked, "Is it better to conquer the world, understand it?" Alexander had never considered there was a difference. At Mysa, in a grove shaded by plane trees, Aristotle built a school not for princes, but for future kings. Here, Alexander and a chosen circle Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus studied ethics, astronomy, biology, and politics. They dissected fish, mapped stars, debated justice, and learned that true rule demands thought, not just force. Aristotle taught Alexander to analyze Achilles, not just worship him. Courage, he warned, is not recklessness. But Alexander listened with half an ear, already dreaming of empires. The classroom wasn't just theory. Between lessons, the boys wrestled, raced, recited Homer, and argued Aristotle into corners. Alexander rarely lost, and when he did, he remembered. Here, loyalty was forged, rivalry sharpened, friendships became the bedrock of an empire. For while others dreamed of estates or local glory, Alexander saw only one horizon: the world. Every lesson, math, poetry, biology, was filtered through a single lens. How can this help me unite it all? Mysa wasn't a school, it was the seedbed of legend. But Aristotle shaped his mind, Macedonia forged his body. This was no land for soft princes. Its hills echoed with war songs, hoofbeats, and the clang of iron. Boys became warriors young. Alexander was expected to become the finest soldier his kingdom had ever known. Training began before dawn. He rode through icy rivers, marched until his feet bled, mastered the Sarisseth 18-foot pike that defined Macedonian might. Philip pushed him relentlessly. Steep climbs, surprise drills, days without rest. He wanted Alexander to know fear and conquer it, and Alexander did not with grim endurance, but with fierce joy. Bruises were badges, exhaustion was fuel. While others collapsed, he kept walking. But this wasn't just discipline, it was imagination in motion as he rode. He saw Persian cavalry on the plains of Asia. He faced the immortals of Xerxes as he marched. He whispered lines from the Iliad not as poetry, but as battle hymns. Myth and muscle fused. Hero and heir became one. And all the while, Olympias whispered, "You are divine." She burned incense, consulted oracles, filled his world with symbols of Achilles and Heracles, not as stories, but as birthrights. Philip offered a counter-truth: greatness is earned in sweat. Aristotle added a third: greatness must be wise or it becomes ruin. Alexander absorbed all three. He would be destined would earn every inch, yet the truest battlefield wasn't on Foreign soil, it was the court of Pella. Philip's palace was a storm of half-siblings, rival wives, and nobles with daggers hidden in their smiles. Every alliance shifted. Every glance carried weight. Olympias warned, "Trust no one who smiles too easily," and Alexander learned to read people like